QSO Today, episode 264, Gordon West, WB6NOA. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, my friend Hans Summers, G0UPL's radio kit company, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. My QSO Today is with one of the most active and well-known hams in amateur radio circles today. Author, lecturer, mentor, podcast co-host, just to name a few of his many hats, Gordon West, WB6NOA, dedicates most of his waking hours to raising amateur radio to new heights, both in our community and outside. He travels the United States every month to attend hamfests and conventions, often speaking and mentoring new and old hams. A few years ago, I was visiting the United States and vacationing in Newport Beach, California, the city next to Costa Mesa where Gordon and his wife Susie reside. Gordo, as he is called by his friends, was kind enough to give me my extra-class license exam in his dining room during that time. Gordo has been on my guest list since the very beginning of the QSO Today podcast, and I'm grateful that he has made the time today to be my guest. He told me at the beginning that this may be the first time that he has told his ham radio story from the very beginning until the present, and he tells it in narrative format for about the first 50 minutes, answering most of my prepared questions without my asking them. I conclude this episode with my questions. Gordon West, WB6NOA, is our hobby's #1 ambassador and promoter of amateur radio through his courses, books, and lectures at conventions and hamfests. He and his wife Susie, N6GLF, are responsible for thousands of individuals getting their ham radio licenses. I'm grateful to have Gordo's story to share with you. WB6NOA, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Gordo?
I am, Eric, and good to hear you after all these years. Go ahead.
Gordo, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Okay, we'll start at the very beginning. Gordon West, WB6NOA, born and raised aboard a boat back in 1942. And back in 42, the radios aboard some of the vessels that my mom and dad piloted up and down the Pacific coast, without a captain, just the three of us and my sister Jackie, the radios were double sideband AM, and I was fascinated at 5 years old to listen in on the radio and couldn't figure out how in the world radios worked, but I just enjoyed them. So born in 42, it was the 50s that I really got serious about radio. I was only 8 years old, yet at nighttime I would tune in to the AM broadcast band. And on the AM broadcast band at night, as your listeners know, Eric, skywaves come in from all over the country, and I was fascinated to pick up stations 1,000 miles away, AM broadcast. And I remember on marine radio aboard Mom and Dad's boat, when I was 5 to 8 years old, that I could pick up at nighttime not only the local marine operator on 2 megahertz, but also the marine radio operators out of Texas, as well as one time out of Florida. And I just couldn't figure out how in that world did this happen. So what I did was I began to pick up study books in that we were aboard the boat. I was taking correspondence courses through a local school, and we would be sailing down into Mexico and as far north as Alaska aboard Mom and Dad's boat, 2 boats, one 104-footer and one 72 feet, and it was just 3 of us.
And what kind of boats were these? Were you folks in the fishing business?
Nope, they weren't into fishing. They were into writing, as I am today. And they would write articles for national magazines like Motorboating and Sailing, Yachting Magazine, Rudder Magazine. And as they would write their articles, we would take these trips up and down the coast. And while they were getting all of their news via the shore folks that they would meet in these strange ports down in Mexico, I would be playing AM receive radio, just fascinated with radio at 5 to 8 years old. At about 13 years old, after about 10 years at sea, I thought, wow, it'd sure be fun to be able to transmit beside just receive. And I would be receiving the AM broadcast band aboard the boat over thousands of miles at night, because at night there was no noise, no power line noise, because we were disconnected far out at sea. And when we finally got back and on shore at age 13, at home, and we lived on a hill in Palos Verdes, California, it allowed me to get fascinated by CB radio, but not 27 megahertz, Eric. This was CB radio Class A down on 462. And one of my high school instructors said, why don't you try this radio out? Here's my call sign, and you can operate as one of my units on Class A CB. And my first transmission after I tuned someone in, and this was a Vocaline radio, and the way you'd tune folks in is not turning a dial, but with a non-conductive wood dowel, you'd push two plates together to increase the capacity, and I forget which way the frequency went, but you'd just sort of push and pull this little plate of a capacitor, and I heard a station. I went back to them, and they were located in Palm Springs, which 50 miles away. I was just delighted. That was my first radio transmission on Class A CB. In 1956-57, at the height of the solar cycle, the FCC made not a great decision, but to open up 23 channels on 27 megahertz. And I was not yet old enough to hold a license, so my dad got me a CB radio license, and I would operate under the license as a unit. So at 14 and 15 years old, I was addicted to talking DX on CB radio 27 megahertz with 23 channels. It wasn't illegal back then, but you did have to use their call sign. Well, I did get a visit from the FCC. They actually drove up to the house to make sure that I wasn't running high power, because my signal was so strong to a monitoring station about 40 miles away. And nope, I got a clean bill of health, but they admonished me that I would be given a citation because my communications on 27 megahertz CB radio, and I'm only like 15 years old, was superfluous, and CB was not to be used in that manner. So it sort of limited my DXing, working stations on 27 megs at the height of the solar cycle. And so I thought, gee, I better explore a little bit about ham radio. So at 15 years old, before I could even drive, Mom drove me down to a ham who had advertised an S38E Hallicrafters receiver. Wow, now I could tune in to the professionals, the hams, rather than the CB radio operators. And you know, Eric, back then in 57, the CB was very well disciplined. There were no vulgarities going out there, and the truckers had yet not discovered CB radio. So we were almost like hams, but we weren't. And I always wanted to become a ham. So at age 15, I started tuning around the Hallicrafters S38E. And this was a wonderful radio because aboard our vessel, Monsoon, we still had the boats. We would many times go out at sea, and this worked on 110 volts DC as well as 110 volts AC. That's the Hallicrafters S38E. What I didn't realize when I ran it on DC was that the chassis was hot, about 110 volts hot. And after a big storm, everything was very wet, and I was in my bare feet, and I went over to adjust the radio and knocked me on my butt. So I was beginning to learn that while tuning in the ham transmissions, and this was a period when they were going from AM over to single sideband, so I had to use the beat frequency oscillator to hear the sideband, that you had to be a little careful around voltage. So in 58 and 1959, when I was 16 and 17, during the summer months, I began sweeping shop of a marine electronics company called Binrad. And I was so fascinated with all the electronic radio projects that they were working on. The depth sounders, the radars, none of those were near as exciting as medium frequency AM radio. So they got me tuning out and dipping these AM marine radios that had a big tube, I think a 6146, put out a whopping 40 watts. It allowed me to get sort of a feel of what it would be like to get a ham license and actually start tuning around and playing ham radio. Because during the summer months, I would actually be installing these radios. Don't tell the FCC. But to install them physically was okay, but I was not permitted to tune them out and go on the air because I didn't have the commercial, would have been the second-class license at that time. So in 1960, I finally did it. I got my novice license, WV as in Victor 6 TWJ. And this was just fascinating to me because it got me on the air. I was doing a little bit of CW, but I was not much faster than about 5 or 6 words per minute. So I knew I'd probably never get my general, but nonetheless, I would still work as a novice. And back then, you had to either use your novice license, and it would go away if you didn't use it a couple of years later. So I upgraded when I started Chapman College in Orange, California, and that's a 4-year liberal arts college. Ended up with a Bachelor of Arts degree, but I ended up with my technician class license. And I was fascinated with voice, much more than CW. So I explored, but I wanted skywaves. So back in 62, while conditions weren't near as great as 57, there were plenty of band openings on the 6-meter band. So at college, I had hidden a little antenna on the roof and played radio on 6 meters and worked a lot of skywaves. And that was with a good old Polycom. Because at the same time of going to Chapman College, I worked for Henry Radio. Yeah, good old Henry Radio. Now, they had 2 stores, one in L.A. on Bundy, and one down here in Orange County at the same location now that Ham Radio Outlet has taken over. But back then it was Henry Radio, and my job, and it was an evening job going to college during the day, was to review radios that were being turned in for the used bench that Henry Radio had a long used bench on. And Grover Chafee, good old Grover, he took me under his arm because many times these fellows would bring in huge transmitters. I didn't have a clue how to turn them on, and Grover would go back there and say, now, Gordo, here's the way you get them on the air, and so on. So I learned a lot from my friends at Henry Radio back in the very early 60s by working that out. Graduated from college in 65, and then the U.S. Army came knocking, and I was inducted in the Army from 66 to 68. No, I didn't go to radio telegraph school. No, the Army didn't put me as a communicator, but rather my work during all this time encompassed also working closely with our church and music, and I became a chaplain's assistant. But more important, they had me regularly working the Special Services Division, not Special Ops, but Special Services, which gave those in the Army here in the USA idle time to do many of the fun things that they would present. So I started our own Aberdeen Proving Ground, as well as White Sands, New Mexico. I started Mars stations, Army Mars, on the Army grounds, and allowed me to patch soldiers all over the world coming in on this Army Mars station on the 6-meter band. But you knew I really needed to upgrade to get to general class. So back then, there were Navy records to increase the code speed up to 13 words a minute, but I was not really that great at code. Although I was musical, there was just not any code that I was going to pick up on my Polycom. So I went back to the good old Hallicrafter S38E and started listening to code over the air. And in 1969, after I got out of the Army, I went to work for a local marine electronics dealer here in Newport Beach. And my job was a fascinating one because they would many times send me on long boat trips to check out radios. And my boat trip ended up from Southern California to Hawaii on the 1969 Transpac. And during the 1969 Trans-Pacific Yacht Race, about a 3,000-mile race from Los Angeles to Honolulu, in the middle of the Pacific, and I was the chief radio operator on marine radio, and the marine radio bands went over to single sideband in about the 1970s, 1969, and I worked a Carr, K-A-R-R, Marconi. I worked this radio aboard the Transpac main communications vessel, and the Carr Marconi allowed me to stay in touch with not only the entrance of the radios and the Transpac yacht race, but it also allowed me to contact shore stations, the company I was working for, and during that time, we had a Mayday call come over, and one of the Transpac operators was hit in the head with a spinnaker pole and needed immediate assistance. Wow, that was like my first big job to handle this. Well, although we did have ham radio, I was not a general, so I couldn't go on the HF bands, but I had good comms with our local United States Coast Guard on marine single sideband on 8 megahertz and 12 megahertz. So I told the Coast Guard our plight and so on, and about a half hour later, we were informed that a military vessel would come to our position, and we did our position finding out of Loran A. This is where you had to cycle match and adjust the Loran receivers. Loran down very low in frequency on the VLF band. So I gave our position. They said, well, stand by. We'll have a emergency evacuation taking place. And we waited and we waited and we looked on radar. We had a small 24-mile radar. Didn't see anybody around us in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And boosh, up comes a submarine. Yep. And we communicated with the submarine on 2 megahertz local. And we did the transfer of Glenn Bricker, who was hit in the head with a spinnaker pole. He did survive, and away they went via submarine. So absolutely amazing what radios would do. So early 70s, I was just fascinated with emergency communications. Met my wife, Susie, in 6GLF, and continued my work up to about 74 when I was just over 30 years old, working with Bartell Marine Electronics. I was doing installations. I was helping with checking radios out on the bench. And my big deal was, thanks to ham radio and technician class, I was like the authority on marine VHF. That's right. In the 70s, they were switching everybody from 2 megahertz marine band, double sideband, first to single sideband. But then they said, 2 megs for ship to ship over short distances could be accomplished like the rest of the world on marine VHF at 156 megahertz. I was a pro because I'd been playing ham radio at 146, so I knew everything about propagation. Well, not everything. And I knew that there was a propagation in July that occurred between Los Angeles and Honolulu at 156 as well as 146. I was the antenna expert on marine VHF antennas. So that was my deal to get me started as I worked for the Marine Electronics Company. But, I was always fascinated with emergency and emergency comms, so I became an emergency medical technician. And at nighttime, I worked for an ambulance company, and occasionally their radios would poop out, and I'd need to take them apart and get them back on the air. So it was a fun job in the early 70s for me. And then I was contacted by a gentleman I had known before, not a ham, but a gentleman that said, we'd like for you to work with us and become possibly one of our national sales managers. And this was Standard Communications back in 1973-74. Now, Standard was one of the first companies to come out with marine VHF radios, and they were crystal controlled. They were a whopping 10 watts of output. So I was like the marine electronics guru up there at Standard. Took about an hour drive to get there, and it was a fun job because Standard began to send me around the country to do seminars all about marine VHF and the standard marine VHF radios. So I was doing boat shows. And then one day they called me in and said, Gordo, we want to now have you help out Eric Deeg with ham radio. We're coming out with a ham radio born out of our marine VHF line. So Standard was the first one to come out with Standard and Henry radio with the Tempo 1, one of the first manufacturers with a crystal-controlled, narrow-band FM ham radio on the 2-meter band. And Standard's handheld was the SRC 146A, which was really a land mobile handheld on my ambulance frequency of 155-160. They just retuned it and changed a few coils. So that's how I got into big time working the boat show as well as the ham show circuits. And 74 was one of my first years at the Dayton Hamvention.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. Now that field day has passed, we enter the contest season and hopefully more time to get on the air. It's time to get the ICOM transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products. Make the most of the summer and contest season with one of these great ICOM rigs. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. The ICOM 7610 features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. The rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. I purchased one myself last fall and can tell you that the ICOM 7300 is as good or better than any rig I've ever had. The ICOM IC7300 includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD card memory slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com or click on the banner on the QSO Today show notes page. And when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO.
And as I traveled around, everybody wanted me to write articles for different magazines about both marine and ham radio. So I ended up with writing for a CQ magazine, 73 magazine in the early 70s, Popular Communications, World Radio, Nuts and Bolts. It was fun. I'd get about 80 or $100 for each article, and wow, this was easy money. So I was having a fun time, and I began to have some great times with our readership that certainly knew a lot more technical than I know, because I'd graduated not with an engineering degree from college, but a business degree. So all went well in the 70s, Eric, and about the mid-70s, a phone call came in saying, how would you like to work for a company that produces a ham radio, single sideband radio? Wow, you mean not a modified one, but a real single sideband. So I said, where are you located? And he says, well, we're near the Bay Area. And the company was Sideband Engineers, the SBE. And their big deal was the SBE 33 and 34. But they said, SBE, we also want you to work and head up our CB radio division. So in the 70s, I did a lot of traveling from Orange County up to Sideband Engineers. I'd stay up there for a week and then come back down and have a few days with Susie here. And it was also in 75, 76 that I needed a good mode of transportation, so I had to retire my black Corvair that made it all the way back to the Army base at Aberdeen, and launched my brand new vehicle that everybody could not believe after I outfitted it with radios, and it's a 1976 Chevy Malibu wagon, chrome wheels. Eric, you remember the wagon, right?
I do. I remember it in the late 70s.
Right. Well, that wagon soon had plenty of radio gear in it, and it was quite the rig. And Eric, I still have it. It's in the garage. It's standing tall. It does have a new engine. If anybody's interested in a 76 with a lot of radio gear and coax in it, let me know. But it still works great. And the wagon worked in quite nicely because beside doing the ambulance, I was also working summertime on weekends as a lifeguard down just south of Newport Beach, where they had some pretty mighty waves. And where we were located, you couldn't get an ambulance down there, so we had to put him in the back of the wagon and take him to the top of the hill. So the wagon did a lot of double duty. Well, then after Sideband Engineers, they had me traveling all over the country representing both SBE CB radios as well as the SBE 33 and 34 ham radios. And they were really more involved in CB radios because that's where the real numbers were in selling thousands of CB radios. And with my very early years as a CB radio operator on Class D CB, it was fun. And they discovered that I loved to do seminars, so I would do CB radio seminars for CB radio dealers on how to better sell their CB radios. Then it happened. Out of almost no word, the FCC said we're going to be opening up the CB radio band in about the mid-70s from 23 channels to 40 channels. Wow! Is this great for the CB radio operators? Yep. Was it great for the CB radio sellers that had thousands of 23-channel radios around? Nope. It was death. And many of the companies just could not really compete with any profits because for every 40-channel radio we sold, we gave away not only one, but maybe two 23-channel radios to try and keep the sales going. So it was a tough time for SBE, but they took good care of their dealers. They gave them deals upon deals, and I have fond memories of both Standard Communications as well as Sideband Engineers for launching my career into ham radio. So reluctantly, I left SBE and began doing more and more ham shows. And in the 80s, Susie and I got married. We finally moved into our permanent house here in Costa Mesa. And I was still doing a lot of seminars, working with companies from Pace that Susie represented, Pace Electronics for CB radios in the early 80s, as well as boat shows, because sideband engineers came out with the industry's first digital CB radio, tied with High Gain that came out with the first digital marine VHF. SBE had the first keyboard marine VHF that we called Keycom. So I continued to do a lot of work with SBE as a consultant doing the boat shows. At the same time, I was just fascinated with ham radio, and that was my real love. Well, my real love was radio, but ham radio. So we once had a phone call one morning, and it was a gentleman asking about my ham radio classes that I started in the early 70s through a local college district. And he says, I understand you're doing classes, and I understand that you are like doing your own little question and answer book with a comb-bound, plastic comb-bound book that we took to our local print shop. And Susie and I would literally do page by page to put it together. And it was selling very nicely for our classes, selling for like $2 a piece. And this fellow says, we would like you to write a book for us because I know of your work in marine electronics, and we'd like for you to maybe come out with some study books that would, along a CB frame, get more CBers into ham radio. And I go, oh, okay, what's the name of your company? And this was Bob Miller, who's still alive today, good friend, lives in Arizona. Bob Miller says the name of our company is Radio Shack. Well, I said, oh, Radio Shack? You want me to do a book for Radio Shack on ham radio? Yep. So the early 80s, I started pulling together a book for Radio Shack. And at the very first, the ham community goes, oh, Gordo, you're selling to like CB radio operators to get them into ham radio? And I go, well, yeah, that's the way I got started. And so it was a couple of years at ham shows that the hams would sort of scowl at me as inviting other radio services to join ham radio. But what they found out was those CB radio operators that were getting tired of the foul language they were soon hearing in the 80s from all the truckers. Because remember, the truckers, no, not the truckers' foul language. It was just the foul language throughout the band. They came from everybody, not just truckers. The truckers actually were using CB the way you intended to stay in touch with each other till the band opened, and then they loved doing the DX. Anyway, I explained to them that those that studied the Radio Shack book, as well as 5-word per minute code cassettes. Gosh, remember the cassette tapes? We had a great time, and finally, at Dayton, they said, you know, this is really working out fairly well. So for many, probably 4 or 5 years, I worked with Radio Shack. And then a company working closely with Radio Shack about a mile away called Master Publishing put together a deal where Master Publishing would then take over the arduous job of printing the books, of editing the books. I would still continue to write the books. So, and they were still sold by Radio Shack, but now Master Publishing could also sell them to ham radio dealers that were really thriving in the 80s throughout the country. And at the same time, our classes were going on. Susie was so great to put up with me almost every weekend doing weekend classes. Oh, my gosh, Eric. When the hams heard, get a tech license in 2 days, you're out of here, Gordo. But as it turned out, when they came to the classes to see how I was giving away ham tickets in just 2 days of training, they saw that we would send the students ahead of time my book, would send the students taking my classes ahead of time the home study materials. They would see all the correspondence between these students. So by the time they came to my weekend class, 2 days, these students could probably pass the test because they knew they were involved in something that required some work, required plenty of homework ahead of time. And then the 2-day class is when I showed them, beside the Q&As on learning the material, I then applied it to the real world of ham radio with demos, lots of demos. And in our classes, it gave me an opportunity to say, wow, I wish we had a ham class back when I was studying, because before then, the league certainly had their good technical manuals, but they were far too technical for me just to get an entry level or a general class ticket. And while I tried to learn the material, it just wasn't the same of working the real stuff, getting my nose out of the book and nose into the tubes and transistors in these radios. So in the late 80s, the ham class is going strong all over the country. We also offered 8-week classes, but I found out that the 8-weekers through the college system were not near as popular as get your license in 2 days. But, of course, you do have to home study ahead of time. And that was my hook that would reel these folks in, was to promise them a 2-day class and then hit them with all sorts of home study and my fun comments in little newsletters to our students to make sure that they would continue to go ahead. And they did. So in the early 90s, the classes were going just great. I'd do a class every couple of weeks here in the local area, and then I started doing classes as far south as San Diego, including a class in Mexico for the USA ham license for mariners. Then I started doing the classes as far north as Alaska. And these ham radio classes were quite effective because all of the students had to study my stuff ahead of time, and that helped me be sure that my books were accurate, that Master Publishing was working over, and that all of the Q&As really related to the real world of ham radio. And this created interest of my ham radio books that I would be writing about in many of the ham magazines. And Master Publishing had a program where I went through several of the different directors running Master Publishing. Finally went to Chicago for the call book to have a shot at it. Went to New York City where a New York group did publishing for a couple of years working with Master. And finally Master Publishing came back to Chicago as well as Texas, where we remember W5YI, Fred Maya. Fred was very instrumental in helping get the books really rolling. And about the 1990s, because of my marine electronics interest, I saw a need for a GROL, commercial book. So I was one of the first to write a commercial book based on Q&As as opposed to the excellent Kaufman, Electronic Communications by Schrader. These were wonderful books and continue to be in my library. But I found a lot of technicians, after they would read those books, would want sort of a review before taking the commercial exam. And that's when the commercial exams began to become privatized, like the ham radio exams in the 80s. So the 90s were a busy one for me, traveling all over the country, as well as continuing my work with the Radio Club of America, where in the 90s they'd made me a fellow. I was quite honored for that. QCWA got me involved, and it was just fun. And, oh, yeah, I got my extra as well, my advanced and my extra in the 80s and 90s, so as well as, of course, passing the general on the first time. But, boy, I was nervous on that 13-word-per-minute code test because the FCC would be like looking over your shoulder as you were doing the code copy. And at the FCC office, this is a classic one, and you're probably one of the first to ever hear the whole story. At the FCC office, when that fellow would stand over you watching you copy, the headphones that we were used were high gain, and they were picking up signals off of electromagnetic loop that ran around the top of the FCC testing room ceiling. And I would regularly take students up there for code and theory tests. And I said, for the code test, I said, you're going to put on these inductive headphones. And as you move your head around, you're going to hear some hum and so on. But I said, don't worry, a voice will come over saying, this is an FCC and so on. Dick Bash was also coming out with stuff at that time. Dick wanted me to get involved with his operation. And he would actually send students to go there and try and memorize the test questions as well as the code. But at the 80s and 90s, that's when the program was turned over to the private sector. But on a few of the last tests at the FCC field offices, I had a student go in there, and we were waiting in the waiting room, waiting for the 20 test and then the 13 test. And all of a sudden, my older ham, this was a ham technician wanting to get his general, he was probably 70. God, old as I am right now recording this for you, Eric. That older ham, he grabbed his earphone and he goes, oh my gosh, what's coming over my earphone? And I said, what is coming over your earphone? And these were hearing aids, of course. They were inductive hearing aids. And he says, listen. And I'm hearing dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, CW. And I go, oh my gosh, you're picking up CW on your inductive earphone? Let's go for a walk. We walked all the way down to the bottom floor of the FCC office. We walked outside. We walked down a block, and his earphones are still picking up the CW that the FCC was using for their ham test. Oh, my gosh. So I thought, well, that would be fun to make sure that my test preparation code tapes followed closely. I never, ever did an identical FCC. No, I never did it. But I did my code tapes and CW practice for test tapes very similar to the FCC. And people this day would say, Gordo, your code tapes are just like what the FCC was sending 40 years ago from their office. And I go, really? And my best reception is I have a yellow dune buggy, and I still have it, Eric. And that yellow dune buggy, I wound about 500 turns of, small little transformer type wire, made a big magnetic loop. I parked 2 blocks away. I could hear the elevators going up and down on this big building. I could hear traffic signals relays clicking. And then all of a sudden, this is an FCC Morse code exam. So I had plenty of the FCC signal that leaked out into the airwaves, and not being on FCC property, I thought, well, heck, if the radio or if the inductive waves go this far, everyone is game. I never told the story to Dick Bash. He would have loved to have done that. And I never ever did a code tape that was the actual message, but it certainly was close to their format. So that was a fun little story, and you'd be surprised how far we picked up those signals. In the 95s, that's when W5LFL, Owen Garriott with the space program began, and I was just fascinated with being able to work him on the very first rotation of his orbit working ham radio. And it was also in the 90s that I needed to up my demos in our classroom. So I came out with something that one of the students said. He says, don't you remember in high school you had put 2 forks, one on each end of a hot dog, and then wire the forks up to 110 and plug it in, and you'd have your own hot dog cooker? He says, Gordo, you ought to do that. I didn't have any hot dogs. Susie says, oh, we got some pickles. I go, well, hell, let's try a pickle. We plugged fork in each end of the pickle, added 110, plug the pickle into plug the forks into 110, staying clear of everything, and bzz, 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 we had our own little spark gap. The whole pickle lit up. And to this date, people don't remember my name, but they go, "Oh, yeah, you were the guy that lit up the pickle." So the blazing pickle is sort of one of the fun little gags that I had. And, I had instructors calling me in 1995, ham instructors. So I suggested W5YI, and they took me up on it to start an instructor program. But I first ran the program by the American Radio Relay League, saying, a lot of folks want to get into ham radio. They know where the books are, but they lack that person, that Elmer in some parts of the country where the Elmer would take them under their wing and get them on the air. And they go, "Well, we really don't know who the Elmers are." And I go, "Well, sure you do." This talking to the league, I says, "Those folks that order 10 or 20 technician class books from either me or you, they're the imperfect ham ambassador." And my deal was the league would have ham ambassadors in all of their areas throughout the country. So when someone would write them saying, I think I want to get involved in ham radio, but I can't find a class, and I don't know what book to study, and I don't know how to do it. That's where we turn it on to the ham ambassador that would then befriend that person in their local city or county and get them into a local class. Well, the ham ambassador program was embraced by Master Publishing and the W5YI group. So we started our instructor academy in the late 95s. And wow, the Ham Instructor Academy got so big that we started offering these classes all around. But the wagon couldn't carry all of the demo stuff, so we bought a 1976 communications van, brand new. Gosh, got it back in 76. And we continue to have the same van, a Road Trek, absolutely outfitted with all the ham radio gear to offer students not just a talking head, but rather live demonstrations of HF gear, VHF, UHF, and so on.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today.
So in the 2000s, we were really rolling, having a great time working with the volunteer examination coordinators as they would develop new question pools, working the Gordo books, working the new commercial book, GROL. That was a big success, and doing tons of ham shows, but still remembering marine electronics, working closely with the Radio Technical Commission for Maritime Services, called RTCM, on their marine electronics education programs for safer boating. So every year I would update our books, the question pool committee once a year with just a 1-year gap will first upgrade tech, and then the next year upgrade general, next year upgrade extra, and then a year off. And that allowed me to then upgrade our commercial book, and it really worked out well. So in the early 2000s, I became very interested in my earlier work back in the 70s at 10,000 megahertz, 10 gigs, ham band, X band. And because I worked with radar as well aboard ships, Boy, I knew a lot about X-band. I knew about the devices. But back in the 80s, they were gunplexers. And now the great X-band gear comes from overseas sources, as well as Down East Microwave in Florida, who brings in overseas gear plus their own gear. And 10 gigahertz is just a fun way to explore all of the ultra high ham radio frequencies. During the early 2000s, upgraded my trusty TAC X2000R reel-to-reel to audio editing that, Eric, you're an expert on, and took me a little while, but now I'm a big fan of some of the audio audition programs, the audition programs, and I can now do that effectively on the computer. But the reel-to-reel, even tape cassettes, still are here in the library because the tape cassettes allow me to put in different audio soundtracks in different orders, and they're always quite reliable. So in 2015, just a few years ago, the instructor program is a huge success, all going well. I finally anteed up and said I need a better radio than some of my smaller rigs here. So I invested in the Kenwood TS990, even though it's a lot more radio than my modest 4-element beam here in Costa Mesa, but allow me to listen in on how the DXers do their thing, tied it in the computer for FT8 and the digital modes. And my work with the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary also required a lot of MT63, 1K and 2K digital communications. So I really got involved with the HF bands again in earnest. I'm not a DXer, Eric, but I enjoy listening to DX, and I do enjoy the DX up on 2 meters when we have band openings to Hawaii. I enjoy the DX up on 10 meters, talking to technician class operators 28.3 to 5 to tell them to get their general. And I enjoy the DX at 10,000 megahertz, but I'm not a contester. I may send in my logs to support the contest, but I have no real interest in collecting a whole bunch of awards. I'm just happy to help support the ham radio world. So now we come to current, and I'm still, gosh, at 77 years old. Susie keeps me going. Monday nights I have, or actually every morning, Monday to Friday, a 40-meter net on 7250. That lets me see what propagation is like on the lower bands as we go through the solar minimum that we're at right now in 2019. And hopefully we'll come out of that and on to solar cycle 25 soon. But Monday nights, I have 3 or 4 nets. Tuesday nights in the evening, 4 nets. Wednesday nights, Ham Nation. And Ham Nation, now over 400 podcasts, working with Bob Heil and George and Don and Amanda and Valerie and just all of the real experts of ham radio. It's a fun show, and after each Ham Nation show, I look at the chat room comments. And if the chat room comments give loads of comments about the topic I was talking about and my color short shots that I present, then I know that was a good topic. But occasionally I'll do a topic that I think, wow, this is going to be great. And nobody in the comment room comments, then I know that, well, that was a bust. So it lets me sort of see what the ham radio audience throughout the world is looking for. And I'm very happy to say that ham radio operators are not just appliance operators these days, but they get involved in ham radio at the appliance level and then dig deeper and deeper in their gear. And this is exactly what we want, because we want more than just appliance operators. So Ham Nation is a great way for me on a weekly basis to really get the feel as to what's happening out there on ham radio. So my future will be to continue our books and audio projects. I try and use as many sound effects. And I was going to give you some sound effects, and maybe I'll send them to you later, Eric. But sound effects of W5, LFL, sound effects of someone spotting something unusual on one of the bands and recording it and sending it to me. But sound effects as well as live demos are so important, so we're not just watching an instructor as a talking head or going in front of a classroom and, oh my gosh, presenting a PowerPoint for the entire 8-week class or the entire 2-day weekend class. Nope. I say you got to do more than just rely on that. Use it certainly for test prep at the end, but we've got to give our students the very best of live demos. And I always enjoyed the live demos. And beside the Blazing Pickle, the other live demo goes way back to the 70s, about your time, Eric, taking a class or seeing me in action, where we had a Swan Cubic ST3 tuner tied into a person's bicycle that they rode to class. We put the bicycle out on the wet lawn, clamped battery alligator clips to the bike frame, attached the other alligator clip to a good metal source nearby, loaded it up. Our first contact was Japan. And we told the Japanese station we were running 40, 50 watts into a Schwinn 16-speed bicycle. And the Japanese fella came back on, oh, bicycle, 16 elements, yes. Well, I don't think I was speaking clear enough. I don't speak Japanese for him to know I was on a bicycle as an antenna. But after we finally, and he laughed and he laughed. And we made plenty of contacts during our 8-week class off of a Schwinn bicycle. We did a crutch. And, you know, these kind of fun things that just come out of nowhere are what get ham radio operators excited about completing the class and getting on the air and trying their experiment with their own bicycle or a real live antenna. So, Eric, that's where we are today. Master Publishing doing well with my books and audio and some of the other great courses that they do. CW. Everybody thought when they did away with the CW that the Gordo CW courses would go away. I was worried that would happen. We are now selling more CW. This is what I'm told by the publisher. I don't sell stuff myself. They're now selling my CW courses. They're 8, used to be cassettes. Now they're 8 compact discs, 8 CDs. Soon we'll probably go to a digital format, although that's hard to manage on a sales side. We're now doing these CW courses like we've never done before. So even though CW is not required to obtain the ham radio license, it allows more and more folks that said, you know, I couldn't do the CW, so I couldn't get beyond the no-code tech. They are now general, and many are extra, doing CW at 30, 40, 50 words per minute, much faster than I can copy. So it's fun to see what happens to ham radio operators. So ham radio, absolutely, I live and breathe it. Susie puts up with this. She and I stay in contact via ham radio when I'm traveling. So ham radio is everything for me. Gordo, WB6NOA. Eric, back to you.
Do you have any thoughts on how to attract new hams, especially young people, to amateur radio?
Kids love computers. They love their smartphones. So we need to, at the very beginning, introduce them to ham radio with FT8, where they can actually see some of the radio signals coming in. They can hear what sounds just like a hash, and then realize that, wow, this is a whole nother way of communicating, and stress the importance to kids that this is just one aspect of our hobby, and that is tying in smartphones to decode the International Space Station slow scan television, which we did a week ago. Wow, that was neat, in memory of Owen Gary at W5LFL. But kids get excited when they see us playing with stuff that they know, and then we introduce them to digital, DMR, ICOM America, D-Star, many of the other digital modes that are out there. We encourage them to link into other parts of the country via a handheld, but to understand all about code plugs, understand all about DMR and what it takes to get on the air professionally. We don't poo-poo the Chinese handhelds, but we do tell the kids, you're going to get a $59 handheld dual band. That's a good deal, but you got to make sure that you're getting help from a local ham that can show you how to program it and how to use it. It's not something where you just buy the radio. So gone are the days that for kids that they would just get a radio and figure it out. A lot of these digital radios, especially the Chinese radios, all have their unique operating techniques. But luckily, most of them are tied into computer cloning. And when it comes to using the computers, these kids come out of the airwaves, and they're your best asset. So we really encourage clubs and instructors to see the value of kids, get them involved with programming on a computer, and they're quiet at home. And then when they start hooking up with stations wireless and have other stations listening in at the same time, wow, this type of chat room over the airways really gets their interest. So, and we also have kids that are musical, and they pick up the CW and love the CW and want more and more. So plenty of things still out there for kids, not just the old-fashioned stuff. And many times we'll bring in an old-fashioned radio, and they are amazed when we hook it up to a Schwinn 23 speed. Gosh, are they now 49 speed bicycle and make a contact thousands of miles away? That indeed, Eric, gets the kids' attention.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. You know, the biggest complaint that I hear from ham radio operators, and it's probably one I make myself, is that we are so busy with our lives that we don't have a lot of time for amateur radio. I understand that you, as you said earlier, that you run a net every morning on 40 meters. How do you make time for amateur radio given your busy schedule?
Well, I take my ham radio everywhere I go, and Susie allows me to have fun, and she, of course, has fun also on ham radio. But you get into a routine where 8:30 in the morning, I'm just waking up, and I have some wonderful net control operators who have taken over from me rolling the net. I used to roll the net myself, and then a good friend, ham radio operator, said, you know, Gordo, you need to spread it around. Let other folks run it. And I thought about that, and you go, you're right, I'm a hog. I got to do that. So we've turned it over to other net control operators. So I'm on giving my local news and a few tidbits from 8:30 to 8:40, and then I'll just continue to monitor the net, begin to take phone calls. And that's my big deal during the day, is getting phone calls from all of our readers, all book readers, all of our audio students. They call here because they know Gordo comes with a book, Gordo comes with the audio courses, and I get a lot of marine radio operators calling me wanting to get involved in ham radio because they realize that far out at sea, it's expensive with a satellite contact to call home and say hi, and now they see the value of WinLink requiring the general class ticket. and the WinLink service is so great. So I try and spread that word. And then in the evening hours, sort of a routine, Susie's got to put up with me interrupting dinner to do a net. But the nets are fun because they really let me see the heartbeat of ham radio. And if you're going to be a ham radio guru, then you got to live it day and night. And that's exactly what I do. And even sometimes when driving around at night in a communications van, I'll turn off everything but the AM radio, tune to a distant station that's not local, and marvel that I'm still able to remember how to tune in DX on the medium frequency band. So continuously playing radio, you'll work it into your schedule as a true ham.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're the co-host of the TWIT podcast, Ham Nation. I've been listening to Ham Nation since episode number 1, so I'm a big fan. You also said that, Bob Heil, K9EID, George Thomas, W5JDX, and Don Wilbanks are your other co-hosts, AE5DW. Let me ask you, what do you think the greatest contribution that Ham Nation has made to amateur radio?
I think the variety of the hosts and the host guests are our contribution to let hams see that there's much more than just walking around with a 2-meter handy on FM. They can begin to see some of the history of ham radio, some of the future of ham radio, and I usually get the most comments on my segment, sort of tongue-in-cheek, when I show some of the funny things that happen, some of the mistakes we make that blow things up. In fact, April 1st, when we have a show on April 1st, I have a big HF receiver no longer in service behind me. And I have a fog machine, and I talk on Ham Nation that I've just restored this radio. In just a moment, we'll turn it on. I reach over and turn it on. And then I'm talking to the audience with my back toward the radio, and all of this, what appears to be smoke, is pouring out of the back of the radio. I can hear my phone ringing in the other room, and it's nothing more than an April 1st joke. So I like to have sort of the levity side of ham radio, poking fun at ourselves, although we all know that ham radio in an emergency can be a lifesaver, and I always stress emergency preparedness and get involved, as I have with the Red Cross and Coast Guard Auxiliary and other agencies, that emergency comms. Part 95.1 is right there in the rules, and that's what we all must be prepared for.
Well, I might point out that Ham Nation is a television show podcast, so I personally have never seen the video. I listen to it in my headphones as an audio podcast, but it's so well done that you could either listen to it or watch it, and that's pretty cool. What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Certainly the biggest challenge are all of the new technologies that are not ham radio that are so inviting to young students. The new STEM and STEAM programs, science, technology, and that is so important for kids in school, but they're looking at other things other than ham radio. So with technology just exploding, a big challenge is just keeping folks focused that in an emergency, sooner or later, the infrastructure, microwave, towers, point-to-point, even cellular, maybe even data on the commercial bands is going to quit, and it'll be up to ham radio. It may happen in our lifetimes, maybe not, but that's a huge thing, is to keep people tuned in that there's still basic communications using either FRS radios, GMRS, or ham radio. And ham radio, we don't need the repeaters. And the other big challenge to ham radio is the high frequency and the very high frequency noise floors. On high frequency, now that California has legalized the cultivation of marijuana, we see a ton of these grow lights coming up, and we see them on our S meter come on and go off. We can even tell the schedule of them. by just watching the S meter go up on HF. And on VHF, as soon as the neighbor turns on the outside LED security light, that just wipes out my weak signals on the 2-meter CW single sideband frequencies. Yes, all of this new technology not only swaying folks from thinking about the lowly ham radio service, which is not so lowly anymore, but also the noise floor that all of these big screen TVs and LEDs, as well as those pesky grow lights, coming in without the FCC taking one or two and analyzing them, that they're horrendously noisy down on HF. That's a huge thing that no magic radio circuit, even my TS990 or my big ICOM IC9100 or Yaesu, the new 101, none of them can do anything to get rid of this constant LED or grow light noise.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, that there really is no Part 15 compliance to these devices anymore.
The FCC just goes by. The FCC is so overworked, underloved, underbudgeted, always having staff cutbacks. The FCC just cannot go out there on any phone call to investigate this. They are overworked, underloved, and it's tough for the hams to do it. I usually, one fella down the street had a grow light, and I knocked on his door, and I said, if you do the grow lights during the day, the police might come by and want to take a look at the minimum amount or maximum amount of plants you're growing. So I said, you ought to put that thing on at night, coming on at night after about 10 o'clock, after the bands are dead, and cycle it off at about 4 in the morning. And he did that, so he's happy, I'm happy, everybody's happy. But these grow lights that come on during the day and evening hours on HF, not VHF, they don't touch VHF, but HF are killers. And the LEDs, even from well-respected LED names, the little LED light bulbs, and you know they're LED because you flick the lights on and off, and it takes a second for the light to come up. If you have 3 different brand bulbs in a 3-light circuit that all come on together, you'll see each one sort of has its own circuit to come on before the other. It lets you know that there's all sorts of LED circuits out there in light bulbs that are different, and some of them absolutely tear up the 2-meter band.
Right, and it's my understanding also that the dimmers make a horrendous noise.
Oh, my gosh. Dimmers, the pulse dimmers. I have audio playbacks that I do on our education courses for ham, for general and extra. And I said, let's listen to a dimmer. What you hear is, and I turn the dimmer off and I go, that's just an innocuous little tiny dimmer. So, yes, dimmers indeed are problems, and I've actually have worked with neighbors to work with them to change out their dimmer to a different type of dimmer. But most dimmers are just killers because they feed back their switching, and that's what they are, just fast switching. Pulse width modulation, and they go and they go and they go for quite a distance on HF.
Well, I think you've given probably one of the greatest pearls of wisdom tonight, Gordo, is telling your neighbor who's using the grow lights with their marijuana farm when they should do it so that they'll avoid being picked up by the police.
Yeah, that really worked for this fellow, and that was back before cultivation was legal. And now that it's legal for small plants, still there are many folks around California, I'm sure, are growing a house full, not a pot full of plants, and they have these grow lights that just tear up high frequency.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I enjoy sitting back and listening. I try and stay low-key, out of sight, listening. And the greatest joy I have is on the air listening to ham operators doing different things. And it can be from working DX to talking about technical topics to looking at how hams who are big on TV, have amateur television, looking at their challenge of going from analog amateur television, ATV, over to digital ATV. And seeing the different modes that are out there, wondering will there be one finally mode for ATV digital, or will we all need to sort of do our own thing? So it's always fascinating to me to tune in to hams via the radio. And going to Hamfest, I enjoy Hamfest. And I realize that with my books and audio, I have a lot of hams coming up. And people say, isn't it sort of a bother for you to have these hams when you're in the restroom wanting to shake your hand? No, you don't want to shake my hand now. But I enjoy it because each one has a story to tell. And while I can't listen to the entire story for more than about a minute because there's now a long line to come up and meet and greet, I enjoy it very much. And it's not, hi, glad to meet you, see you later. I always like to ask them, what bands are you on? What's your greatest excitement of ham radio? Like you, Eric, being able to draw out from these folks an interesting aspect that I can then apply to my teaching of ham radio. So being exposed, sometimes I feel very overexposed, but I always try and make time for everybody that wants to say hi, because ham radio, people communicating, this is the best for me.
Now, you go to so many ham fests. Do you have one that's your favorite?
I always enjoy the Dayton, Ohio Ham Fest, now moved just in time after that tornado to Xenia, Ohio. But, you know, every Ham Fest, sometimes it's in the middle of a desert. We do one in January called Quartz Fest. No AC, that is no alternating current other than what your rig will generate. No plumbing. No fresh water. Everybody's on their own. And that is a fun Quartz Fest where we actually do seminars and so on. And it's always a favorite. But every ham fest I go to, big or small, and I've been to some, what were going to be, they thought, a big ham fest, and it turned out to be a micro ham fest. But, you know, I had so much fun just meeting the vendors and so on. And it's the vendors, these vendors, the mom and pop vendors selling the little gadgets and gizmos, Roger of Wired Co. selling LEDs and turntables. These are the heart of ham radio real operators. They probably lose more money than they make going to all these ham fests, but they are there to work the hams that come by to get their products. So I have huge respect for those individual hams, as well as Kenwood, Yaesu, ICOM, Alinco, Bridgecom, all of those manufacturers of radios that continuously support the ham industry by continuously supporting visibility by going to Hamfest. So that's one of my big pleasures, is watching all that is going on to keep ham radio humming.
Do you think that we're in a renaissance of ham radio? Do you think this is a ham radio renaissance?
Could be. You know, a lot of people say, well, ham radio, it's going to be like a postage stamp collection and so on. It may be, but I'm delighted to see, comes to mind, Bridgecom, who's bringing in these Chinese radios. But the company realized that bringing in these import radios at a fraction of the cost of what would be a regular professional ham radio from the Big Four, it's fun to watch their marketing efforts to keep things going. So, yep, we've got to be cautious that we're not going to plateau out and then start going down. I think the ham radio service is going to continue to grow, but that's thanks to folks that do something more than just pick up the phone to take an order that someone is placing. We've got to have those manufacturers and independents out there supporting ham radio, and that they are doing. Kenwood, Yaesu, ICOM, Alinco, wow, they're making ham radio happen with gear, and so I think we're going to continue to slowly grow, but we've got to be cautious that we don't go the way of stamp collecting.
Can you estimate the number of hams that you've created in your life, Gordo?
People have asked me how many hams have I licensed, and Susie and I, thousands, I would say. And those that have studied my books and so on, one of our publishers said that we've probably done 8 out of 10 that have come in contact with our training materials. So it's always fun. I'm always honored to have folks saying, as an extra class, that they started with us at Radio Shack. But it's a huge number, and it is fun. For me, we're like the mom and pops. We aren't making much money at this, especially with just only a royalty here and there on the products. But it is fun for me to watch the service continue to help each other in making the most and getting the most out of all we can offer to the general public for emergency comms and ham radio. So 8 out of 10, they tell me, not those in classes, probably out of classes, certainly thousands with the actual classes, but those studying the materials, a whole bunch of folks out there. And I'm just honored to be working side by side the American Radio Relay League. It's got to be rolling their eyes going, oh my God, what's going on now? But as everyone will say, I'm a strong supporter of the American Radio Relay League, their ham instruction, and those valued ham radio instructors that are ARRL instructors, W5YI ham instructors, and the independent Elmers. Keep it up, everyone. We want to continue to watch our service grow.
Well, I also have to thank you for my extra class amateur radio license. As you recall, I came to your house a number of years ago while I was on vacation in Newport Beach, and you gave me my extra class license examination there. So I'm publicly thanking you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. Yep. I'm fortunate to have across the street a volunteer examiner, and we have several local hams that I can make a phone call to, and they come over to the house. So we had 3 extra class VEs, and it was a joy watching you take the exam and doing as well as you did on the test.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, too. What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
On hams coming back into our hobby, immediately come up on, of all things, the 2-meter FM channels. Join a local 2-meter or 440 or just a local ham club that you hear about on 2 meters, talking about club meetings, and get involved at the club level, because every club in ham radio has their specialty. Some clubs are absolutely digital. Amateur television, all they talk is about ATV and other things like propagation. The San Bernardino Microwave Society, as well as weak signal societies throughout the country. Their club members will get you homed in on working 2-meter sideband and CW, working meteor scatter, and working digital modes, FT144, FT8, and many of the other modes. So the clubs are really strong supporters of getting those hams getting back into ham radio tuned in. And the best way to find a club is either go to the league's club page and look up via zip code, or simply get on the 2-meter band, find, be sure and have a 2-meter ARRL repeater directory for the right subaudible tone. Tell them you're a pal of Gordo, join that club, go to the meeting, and you're going to be launched back into ham radio with a lot of changes that I've seen and they've seen since the early 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Gordo, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been a real gas. I know we've been trying to get together for years, and I'm so happy that we were able to do that today.
Well, Eric, you're the only one in the world that I've ever disclosed from 1942 up to where we are close to 2020. So you're the only one that has the history, and I've got it here on a piece of paper. There it is. It's going in the trash can. So you've got it. You get to roll with it, and I am honored to be aboard QSO today.
Thanks so much, Gordo. 73.
73, Eric, from Gordo, WB6 November Oscar Alpha, now tuning 5KC up.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope you enjoyed this QSO with Gordo. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WB6NOA in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.